Now let's look at equity share. So red is the state equity share, yellow is institutions, which mostly refer to SOEs. These are legal definitions, SOEs. The blue are individual, private individuals, and the gray is collective. And what do we see? We see that, not surprisingly, the state is mostly owned by the state and SOEs, other state-owned firms. The collectively is mostly owned by collectives and other SOEs. And then these mixed state ownerships are a mix. And then the interesting thing is when we look at the so-called private sector, we see a huge amount of equity that's actually owned by the state. So if you add up the red line, which is state-owned equity, with the yellow line, which is SOE-owned equity, I mean, we can just ignore the gray line. That'll make it even bigger. What we see is that 70 to 80% of equity in these firms are owned by the state. Most importantly, these joint stock firms, we'll see why they're important later, have a huge amount of equity that's owned by the state. About 80% is owned by the state and SOEs combined. And very little equity is actually owned by individuals. This includes the publicly held joint stocks firms that are being traded on the stock market. And then what we see is that individually owned firms, they really do look like private entrepreneurs. About almost 70% of the equity are owned by individuals, and there's some amount that are owned by SOEs and a bit that are owned by collectives. Now let's see how much change there is between 1998 and 2005. Like, is there more as a state moving out of the private sector? Well, we don't see any evidence of that. If we look at the so-called private sector firms, these four type of firms, what we see is that, individually owned firms, the private entrepreneurs, they're still very private, with most of the equity owned by individuals and about 30% owned by SOEs. But if we look at the publicly traded and the privately held joint stock firms, there is a shift in how much equity is being owned directly by the state versus how much is owned by state-owned enterprises. But if you sum them up, it's still the same. About 70 to 80% of equity is owned by state or state entities. So we don't see any evidence of the state moving out of the private sector. Now you can say, well, now let's see which type of firms are really growing over time. So to get a sense of what's really driving private sector growth in China. Well, what you see is that this is the number of firms over time. So between 1998 to 2005. So what you see is that the number of individually owned firms, these are the private entrepreneurs, it truly is exploding over time. Triple, quadruple, I think it went up by 6 times between 1998 and 2005. These are the number of firms with more than 5 million market cap. Whereas the publicly held joint stock firms hasn't changed that much. The privately held joint stock firms have also really increased in numbers. And, consistent with this idea that SOE, the state is moving out of the economy and SOEs are shutting down, what we see is that the number of state-owned enterprises and collective-owned enterprises are decreasing. And now let's look at firm size, right? Are firms, what's happening to firm size? Well, when we look at firm size, this isn't firm size, this is the total firm asset over time. This is all of the total asset of all of the firms in each sector over time. What we see, interestingly, is that despite the fact that the number of firms, of state-owned enterprises are decreasing, the total asset owned by state firms in the economy is not decreasing. In fact, for the last couple of years, it decreases and then it actually increases. When we look at the private firms, the total firm asset for the privately held joint stock firms and the publicly held joint stock firms are both increasing a lot. This means that they're able to raise a lot of revenues, and they're increasing in firm size. And then when we look at the total the asset from individually owned firms, not surprisingly, it's also increasing. But note that which isn't surprising because we see that the number of firms increasing. So the next question we want to ask is, well, what's happening to average firm size? Which is important if we think that individual firms have been able to get around credit constraints. Firm size should be growing. And what do we see? What we see is that despite the fact that the number of firms are increasing and total assets are increasing, average firm size isn't really increasing at all over this time. Average firm size is growing a bit. You see a bit of positive movement, but not very much at all. Whereas if you look at the publicly held joint stock firms, it's increasing a lot. I mean, this isn't surprising, right? So firms decide to be publicly traded because they're trying to raise capital. So this just says that the stock market is working for these firms. And here's another interesting fact. If we look at state-owned enterprises, the average state-owned enterprise is actually increasing in size. So what this says is that while the state has decreased the number of firms that it directly owns during the enterprise reforms, after the enterprise reforms, the surviving state-owned firms have been increasing in size. So how do we just a quick summary, what do we really see in the data? And we haven't done anything to the data. This is just the raw data of all manufacturing firms in China. What we see is at least after 98, we don't see any evidence that the state is trying to relinquish more control of the private sector or of the economy as a whole. State-owned enterprises have not changed in numbers. They're increasing in size. So the total amount of assets owned by state enterprises are actually increasing. We don't see the state sector moving out of the private sector. The amount of equity in the private sector owned directly by the state declines very little. It's still over 30% in 2005. And if you add up the amount of equity owned by the state and SOEs, what you see is no change between 98 and 2005. It's about 80% in both years. And finally, when we look at the individually owned firms, the firms that are run by private entrepreneurs, we see evidence of this observation that there are more and more entrepreneurs in the Chinese economy. What we don't see is their firms growing in size. So this is actually consistent with the fact that, with this idea that credit constraints and legal constraints are actually binding. And what does this say about this idea that private entrepreneurship is fueling Chinese growth? What this doesn't actually say that private entrepreneurship isn't fueling Chinese growth. What it says is that if it is doing it, it's doing it in cooperation with the state. And what do I mean by that? What I mean to say is that it's entirely possible that there is we see that there is a dynamic and very active and growing private sector. What we don't see is that those firms are growing in size, but what could be happening is that as entrepreneurs become very successful, they're asked to join former state-owned firms or to merge with former state-owned firms, becoming these privately held joint stock or publicly held joint stock firms. In other words, one thing that people say is happening in China on the ground is that the state is kind of using the private sector as a screening device to see who has talent. And when they see who has talent, they give them a lot of capital from former SOEs. And then these then become these joint stock firms, which we see are growing. And this is something that needs a lot more investigation. I'm just speculating at this point. All right, so the second question. I think I'm doing okay on time. The second question, is Chinese democratization cosmetic? So I realized, until I started presenting this paper, this is a more completed paper and less speculative than the last. I didn't realize that most people didn't know that there was democratization in China, so I'll give a very quick preview. China, of course, is autocratic overall in the sense that the Chinese central government is not elected. However, democratic elections, were introduced for village chiefs starting in the early 80s. And by today, all villages have elections for the position of the village chief. And since 70% of the Chinese population resides in rural areas and are administered by villages, this means that 70% of the population, the most immediate level of government that they're in contact with, actually has democratic elections. So the issue here is that while the election for the village chief is quite democratic, or supposed to be, it's not clear whether this is just for show or whether this is really something that has anything to do with what we think of democracy. And why do we say that? Well, we say that because in the village, there's still a village party secretary that shares power with the village chief. And the party secretary is appointed, as he's always been, by the county level the county level Communist Party, which is appointed by the prefecture level Communist Party, and so on and so forth. And also, elections have been limited to the local level. So while these elections have been completely phased in at this point, we don't see the introduction of elections at higher levels of the government. So even if these elections are very democratic and they do have some real power at the local level, it's not clear whether this makes a difference if the rest of the country is autocratic. And finally, many observers of these elections have found them to be very procedurally imperfect. In the early elections, a lot of the candidates weren't nominated by the villagers; they were just appointed by the party. The party. So they had to appoint more than one candidate, but they were still appointed. And then also there's a high prevalence of bad practices, like a roving ballot box, no anonymous voting, voting by proxy, lots of things that would corrupt the quality of the elections. So there's a lot of people are very cynical about these elections. So, for instance, and they say that, despite the introduction of this pretty massive reform, because remember, this is 70% of all of China now have elections and open nominations at this point. A lot of political scientists think that they really didn't have any effect. So this is a quote from a very well-known political scientist from NYU in the Foreign Affairs in October 2005. He says, although the Chinese economy has grown explosively, its politics have remained essentially stagnant. There's really no change, implying that these local democratization reforms had no effect.